Assalamu alaikum, greetings of peace. We are honored to continue with Dr. Ibrahim, his lecture on the history of Palestine. With everything that is happening in Palestine, especially in Gaza, there's a lot of interest in learning the history and learning what is happening and who is best other than a professor of history to give us the history of Palestine. Not only Dr. Ibrahim is a professor of history at Cal Poly Pomona, but Dr. Ibrahim is a Palestinian himself. We had the first part of the history of Palestine. He gave us this lecture a few days ago, and we are honored to have him give us the second part. And I just want to remind everyone that there will be a third part about the history of Gaza specifically that Dr. Ibrahim, inshallah, will give us on Thursday at 7 p.m. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. We are looking forward to hearing the second part of your lecture about the history of Palestine.
Thank you very much again. Let me just recap. For the last hour, we discussed the history of Palestine from prehistory through the Islamic period. And basically I wanted to show that the geographic entity that today we call Palestine it has come into being largely in the late 19th, early 20th century, especially with the after the Sykes-Picot Agreement was signed between England and France to divide up the Near East amongst themselves, and with the promise of the Balfour Declaration to create a Jewish state in that particular area. And of course, we also discussed the anomalies with the Balfour Declaration on the whole idea also of the mandate, how the mandate was supposed to allow and nurture the local population to come to level of a statehood so that they can join the newly formed League of Nations. But instead, the British imperial policies were actually set in motion for the implementation of the Balfour Declaration and the creation of a Jewish state in the area. I also discussed the changing demographics and the reasons behind the changing demographics, and more specifically in the 1930s with the rise of the Nazis in Germany and the flight of Jews from Germany into other parts of the world, where in some other parts they were unwelcomed and actually rejected. But in Palestine, of course, they were welcomed and were allowed to settle in an enormous number that began to create certain tensions, and more specifically because of the sequestration of the land from the Palestinian people for the benefit of the newly arrived Jews. And that created, of course, urban problems, employment problems, social problems, and not to say that the Palestinians began to see that their land is being taken away from them so that they and other people create a state of their own to the exclusion of the Palestinians. We also discussed the circumstances for the creation of the partition map that you see on the screen. By 1945, the British imperial forces were basically defeated. Even though morally they were the victors in World War II, they economically, militarily, they were exhausted. And you might also know that they began to shed their colonies not only in the Middle East, but elsewhere in Africa. India, for example, also became independent in 1948. So because of its inability to find a particular solution to the dilemma that they themselves put themselves in with the Balfour Declaration and the 1939 White Paper, they gave the newly formed, once again, United Nations the responsibility of finding a solution. And the United Nations eventually came with a partition plan, and the partition plan, you see the map right there on the screen. This is not the first time that the partition of Palestine was suggested. As I mentioned in the previous hour, the Peel Commission was one of its recommendations, of course, was to partition the country into a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. The Peel Commission, of course, you will recall that came at the heels of a great many disturbances, the Great Palestine Revolt of 1936 to 1939. So the United Nations Commission that studied the question came with this partition plan again, and this was by hook or crook passed by the UN General Assembly in 1947, November 29th, 1947. And I think I mentioned the anomalies of this particular plan. The whole issue, of course, has a great deal of contradictions, but the contradictions continue. And the contradictions with this plan is that the blue map, I mean, the blue region is allotted for the Jewish state, and upwards of more than half, a little bit less than half, more than half, I mean 51%, 52% of the area were given to the Jewish state, and the other area, the rest was given to the Arab state or the Palestinian state. The Jewish state was supposed to take the most fertile regions of the country. And of course, it was largely inhabited by Palestinians themselves. And so 49% of the population of that Jewish state were Palestinians, Christians and Muslims. And that is when the issue began, of course, of the refugees, of the forced expulsion of Palestinians from their homeland, and indeed from 29 November 1947 to May, upwards of 250 to 300,000 Palestinians were driven out of that particular territory. I mentioned that some of them went to north to Lebanon, some into Syria, and others what became the West Bank, and some went down even into what eventually becomes the Gaza Strip. So according to the British mandate, the mandate was supposed to end in May 15th. 1948, and so at that particular day, Israel was declared independent by the personnel of the Jewish Agency, headed by Ben-Gurion. And at that moment, or at that time, the surrounding Arab armies began to come into the area to prevent further refugees and to prevent the Israeli newly constituted armies to take more territory than they had been given. And that is what is known as the War of Independence, as far as Israel is concerned. It is always important to remember that the Arab countries were still under control of the imperial powers themselves who brought Israel into being. These forces cannot really be considered truly independent armies. Nonetheless, they are given the moniker of Arab armies invading. Also, it is also very good to remember that at the time, there was a lot of conflicting interests between the Arab leaders. King Abdullah of Transjordan had always designs to take over Syria. And this is way back, goes to the 1940s World War I, when the British promised Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his sons to set them up as monarchs in the areas that were going to be taken over by the British and the French from the Ottoman Empire if they, what is known as the Great Arab Revolt. Faisal was set up temporarily in Damascus before he was thrown out by the French. Eventually, the British set him up in Iraq to form a Hashemite kingdom of Iraq, which will last from 1921 to about 1958. King Abdullah of Transjordan was always wanted to go over to Syria and have claims to that. King Farouk was also concerned that Abdullah might accrue a great deal of power and that will be a threat to himself. And so it's a dilemma of the time that these Arab leaders were afraid of each other, afraid of each other's designs, but at the same time confronted with a new colonial factor. Indeed, the result is a failure, basically. They failed to achieve the ends, that is to prevent further refugees from leaving their homeland in Palestine, and also failed to prevent the Israeli forces from taking over more territory. And so from May 15th, 1948 to about December 1st, 1948, when the armistice agreement was signed between the Israeli forces and the Arab armies, another 450,000 Palestinians were made refugees. So a total of, by the end of 1948, there was at least 750,000 Palestinian refugees who had been forced out of their homeland. Again, this is by force. This is like a true ethnic cleansing that was facilitated by the massacres of certain villages, whether in the north or central Palestine or in the south. And actually, more and more, we're beginning to hear that there are massacres that happened that we still becoming aware of, thanks to the work of certain historians. For example, you can, Ilan Pape, who is himself an Israeli historian, revisionist historian, wrote a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, where he discussed not just the most famous one that we know of, that is Deir Yassin, but others that were committed by the Israeli forces to scare the local population, who, as I mentioned in the previous hour, actually had been left without leaders because the British policy had been designed to leave the Palestinians leaderless, whether exiling their leaders or assassinating them, and preventing them from acquiring arms and acquiring training and the know-how to be able to resist. On the contrary, they have trained and gave arms to the Jewish militias. So it was an imbalance of forces that resulted in the great migration, great flight of Palestinians from their homeland under threat of the gun. This is what happened to my village, Jimzu. Again, Jimzu was evacuated, ethnically cleansed after July 11th, 1948. Now, this is what is called the Nakba, the great catastrophe of Palestine. And this was the greatest challenge to the emergent Palestinian nationalism. As I mentioned earlier, once again, when the Sykes-Picot and the British Mandate were established by England, they basically sequestered or cut off the area of Palestine from the rest of their natural extension and began to create a unified history for this particular region. And that's what would be the beginnings of Palestinian nationalism. By 1948, everybody thought it was crushed. Palestinian nationalism was crushed, and more so because now they are looked at as refugees. Incidentally, the United Nations felt responsible, of course, and created an agency called the United Nations Relief Works Agency, and specifically to deal with Palestinian refugees. And so they provided some food, provided some provisions, eventually they would put up some schools and other facilities to social, cultural, educational, to take care of the refugee issue. The West Bank that became part, let's see, and let me go over the Nakba again a little bit, because it's very important to realize that that's when these villages that you see here as brown dots were totally destroyed. As soon as people would be evacuated from the area, the Zionist forces would destroy the town, and that is specifically so that they will not come back. There is no place to come back to. And upwards of 525 villages were destroyed altogether. This is where these 750,000 Palestinians had lived. You can see in the map right here where eventually the green line was established as by December 1st, 1948. Incidentally, this is the birth date that is given to me. I may have been born a little bit before or after. It was, who knows exactly when, but it was said December 1st, 1948, the Armistice Agreement date. So the destroyed villages, you can see how they are by 1948, how the population is divided up, and where the partition plan, as you can see, that they were basically the Jews, which is in the purple area, are still the minority. It's debate, 51%, 49%, 50%. It's really, it's an iffy situation where these areas had been ethnically cleansed, and most of them now you can see how it's easier for the people in the north to go into Lebanon. The people in the south here would go into Gaza. 70% of the population of Gaza today is refugees from 1948, where the people over here would be pushed into the West Bank. And so the West Bank, for further alienation of Palestinian nationalism, was claimed by King Abdullah of Transjordan. Gaza came under the administration of Egypt, and this will last, this situation will last until 1967. So the Nakba is a catastrophe of all sorts because the nationalism was crushed, the livelihood was taken away, the land was taken over by Israel, and they were not, of course, allowed back. No one was allowed back, contrary to United Nations resolutions, and especially by its Secretary General, the push by Dag Hammarskjöld, who was eventually assassinated by the Zionists, specifically because he was always calling for the return of Palestinian refugees to their home. So from 1949 to 1956, there had been some attempts to come to an agreement as to what to do with the situation. First, let me mention and bring in a factor that becomes very important for the Middle East from 1950 all the way to 1973, and that is the rise of the Egyptian free officers. When King Farouk entered the war in 1948, it turned out that many of the armaments that the Egyptian army was using was faulty. And in addition to the fact that there was really no will to fight, and that King Farouk was actually looking elsewhere, afraid of King Abdullah, that has created a situation by which many of the officers who were involved in the 1948 war began to work to replace such a corrupt government. And at the time, 1949, 1950, this was actually in Egypt, the heyday of an organization that started in 1925 called the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood started by a school teacher named Hassan al-Banna, who responded to the inequities of British imperialism along the canal, along the Suez Canal. And he was in Ismailia, a city on the Suez Canal. And the Muslim Brotherhood started out as a social and economic organization that wanted to take care of the Egyptian people and offer them the type of help and assistance that the government should have been doing. But of course, the government was under British control, and the British were not interested in helping the Egyptian people. As a matter of fact, in 1882, in Egypt, education, primary education for girls was compulsory under Ismail Pasha. When the British took over, the Governor General Lord Cromer abolished all schools, and he derogatorily said that the Egyptians have no mind. Are you kidding me? Educating the Egyptian mind? And so they really did a number on the Egyptians by abolishing schools, and were not necessarily interested in the welfare of the Egyptian people, specifically so that they can finance their debt, so to speak. So the Muslim Brotherhood was the organization that began to take care of these issues. And by 1948, it was the largest organization, the largest, if you want, political party in the whole of the Middle East. And so the free officers and the Muslim Brotherhood began to organize underground, of course, and eventually by 1952 carried out the Egyptian Revolution in the summer of 1952. And several officers became very well known in that particular revolution. Jamal Abdel Nasser, Anwar al-Sadat, and Muhammad Naguib. Eventually, politics, of course, played a great deal of role here, and Nasser himself emerges as the foremost leader of Egypt, and Nasser becomes a figure that was, of course, very hurt by what happened in 1948, and begins the social and political and economic reforms in Egypt that are necessary to bring Egypt to a point where they can do something about this disastrous defeat, and also to be able to take care of their own population. And in the 1950s, of course, development economic development was a particular a virtue of all of these newly decolonized countries, because as once again, colonialism was really to develop or underdevelop, if you maybe a better term. And indeed, Egypt was underdeveloped, was a feudal state. 10% of the population owned 90% of the land. And that is an anomaly that the young officers, or the free officers as they call themselves, began to look into. And distribution of land for the peasantry. And the greater project that was necessary was to create a hydroelectric power so that they can produce the energy that is necessary for such a development. And they tried to come to the United States, actually. First and foremost, they came to the United States to ask for help. The John Foster Dulles and the Dulles brothers were in charge of the foreign affairs. And actually, the Egyptians were rejected. The offer was that, yeah, we can give you tin cans and, food, this kind of stuff that you can survive at, but not the kind of equipment that you can build the dam that they were proposing. And eventually that drove Nasser and his free officers to look elsewhere. And indeed, the Soviet Union was very much there to pick up the ball, so to speak, because from 1949 onward, the Cold War had already started. And the principals, of course, were the United States and the Soviet Union. And indeed, blocs began to be formed globally, affiliated with one or the other. And this, of course, will reflect itself on the Arab world too. The Arab world was divided in two blocs, a bloc that is along with the West, and a bloc that was along with the East. And the bloc that was along with the East, headed by Jamal Abdel Nasser. So when he failed to get the financing of the Aswan Dam, Egyptians and the nationalized the Suez Canal. By that time, the Suez Canal had been under British control from 1882. And they had a lease all the way until 1999, just like Hong Kong, until 1999. And so Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, and of course, to the great consternation of England. England did not want to lose such a strategic asset. After all, they have been formulating their foreign policy on the protection of the Suez Canal as a passageway to their crown jewel, if you want, to India. Now, another factor that here would be very important to recall is that in North Africa, there was a great deal of nationalistic sentiments that have been emerging and developing along these years. And in 1952 onward, the Algerian people were actually in a great deal of turmoil and organization so that they can bring their country to freedom. The French didn't like at all the fact that Abdel Nasser, or simply Nasser, was helping the Algerian people and eventually the Algerian Revolution. I remember as a child in the West Bank, when I went to school, we had to pay tuition, and the tuition, we had to pay an equal tuition to the Algerian Revolution. And so not only Nasser was helping the Algerians, the people themselves were helping the Algerians towards their liberation. But the French, of course, detested the fact that Nasser was leading this campaign. And the British now have another reason to detest, quote unquote, Nasser. And the Egyptians and the French colluded with Israel. Now, Israel, of course, is the child of these colonialist powers, and now it's turned to deliver, so to speak. And they called on Israel to join this tripartite aggression in 1956. This is the West Bank. In 1956, the three powers, England, France, and Israel, agreed that at a certain point, July, in the summer of 1956, Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula. By the way, invading the Sinai Peninsula, that meant that they will have to go through Gaza. This is the first time they would go through Gaza, and then march towards the Suez Canal. And of course, the plan was that the British would call upon people of Israel as well as Egypt. Of course, Egypt is not going to sit idly by while these troops are moving towards the canal. They will ask that these two combatants, that is Egypt and Israel, to withdraw a certain number of limit or a certain number of miles away from the Suez Canal, knowing very well that Egypt is not going to abide by such a declaration. And immediately they began to land troops into the canal zone, the French as well as the British. But somehow the whole plan backfired on these powers, and despite the loss of human life, the Egyptians came out to be the victor, and Nasser, rather than being humbled and humiliated by this particular invasion, turned out to be a much more victorious figure than these powers had hoped that he would be. So indeed, from 1956 onward, Nasser's reputation would skyrocket within the Arab world, and eventually he begins to formulate the ideas, not that he's Egypt alone, but the whole Arab world needs to unite so that in their unity they can confront these imperials. So this is the era of what is known as Arab nationalism. That is, the slogan was from the Gulf to the ocean, من المحيط إلى الخليج, من الخليج إلى المحيط. That is from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, one nation indivisible. That is the great cry of Arab nationalism. And indeed, being a victor, he begins to, and the Egyptian revolution continues, so to speak, and they begin to support those of the Arab nations who aspire to liberate themselves either from backward regimes that they are ruling them or from the colonial remnants that had continued to exist. So that by 1958, the Hashemite monarchy in Baghdad was toppled by, again, an army revolution that brought a figure by the name of Abdul Karim Qasim. Now, that, of course, was a very, very scary moment for the West, because it looks like the pan-Arabism, Arab nationalism has borne fruit, so to speak, and especially when there was talk of uniting with Egypt. The unity between Iraq and Egypt did not take place, but actually the unity between Syria and Egypt had taken place by 1958 in the formation of the United Arab Republic. Now, that set the stage for a great many moments of tension in areas in Lebanon, for example, in Jordan. And so in Lebanon, actually, American troops had landed in 1958 to forestall the movement of Lebanon into the camp of Arab nationalism. Jordan, a great deal of demonstrations. Actually, I was part of those demonstrations in a student in Ramallah at the time. And it looked very much that the West Bank was once again under occupation of the Jordanian army. And of course, at that time, still we given Jordanian citizenship, Palestinian nationalism is under cover, so to speak, under wraps because of the great appeal of Arab nationalism and the leading figure of Nasser. And so late 1950s constitute a threshold where the imperialist power doubled down on their efforts to suppress and to keep the Middle East under control. And remember, the Middle East is strategically located, geographically speaking, and of course, oil had been discovered already and indeed had become a major factor in global economy, and they didn't want to lose that at all. The 1952 counter-revolution in Iran against Prime Minister Mossadegh, which was actually orchestrated by the British and mostly by the Americans, is another example of how they wanted to keep the region under control, the region and its resources under control, because Mossadegh was the first one to nationalize the oil companies and the oil production in the region. It will be followed later on, of course, but Mossadegh wasn't, and he eventually was removed under the pressure of and plans and designs by the American CIA at the time. So the 1950s really see a time when Palestinians were mostly regarded as refugees. Palestinian nationalism was not necessarily discussed in the face of Arab nationalism. And as refugees, as people who lost their land, and I'm a perfect example, there is nothing for us to do but to go to school. So, and this is what becomes the national character of the Palestinians, is that Palestinians become the most well-educated people in the region. And not only so, but we educate the region. So Saudi Arabia, for example, coming out of the Middle Ages, and they needed schools and teachers, and so who were the teachers? And Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates and all of this, they didn't have anything. And so indeed, Palestinians become the educators of the Middle East in general. And in Algeria, eventually, of course, in 1962, they win independence. When by 1964, they also go through their Arabization. And Algeria, mind you, was colonized by the French since 1883. And the first thing that the French did in 1883 is to abolish all of the foundation of schools, the Waqf or Habous, as they call it, that supported education. And so indeed, they were made illiterate. And if there was any education, you had to be educated in the French schools. And of course, they selected who they wanted. And so by 1964, they also wanted teachers who knew Arabic, and who was available? Palestinians. And so indeed, by the mid-60s, the Palestinians are the educators of the Middle East, especially in the high school levels, because this is where you start. And wherever the Palestinians went, of course, they brought their own issue. They brought their own history. They brought their own concerns. And it is as such that the rest of the Middle East begins to be so much concerned with the Palestinian cause. in Morocco too, in 1936, the first time that the Moroccans established their own schools, you know, they call it public schools, or actually they call it private schools, because it's a French system. The private schools, that is the Moroccan schools, were designed according to schools in Nablus, for example, and they were staffed by some Palestinians. And so you can see that in the 1960s, the issue of Palestine, the cause of Palestine, becomes Arab worldwide, not just for the Palestinians themselves. Now, of course, in the 1960s, which is the time now, I 6:43, my God. So in the 1960s, a phenomena was taking place in the region of Israel-Palestine. By the way, going back to the, this might have to do with it. In 1956, this is the beginning of the loss of England and France as superpowers, where they were replaced by the United States and the Soviet Union in as far as the Middle East is concerned. And both, this is the first unusual time, unique time, when the Soviet Union and the United States agreed on one thing, and that is England and France have to evacuate, leave the Suez Canal area, and the Israeli troops have to withdraw back to the boundaries of May 1956. And that is the beginning again of the supremacy of the two new superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, as far as the Middle East is concerned. So in the middle of this Cold War that is taking place now globally, but it is also very important to realize that it is taking place locally, that is in the Middle East. The idea that Israel is there began to be not only threatened, but the threat is there became to be internal, in the sense that for the first time, more people were leaving Israel than coming in. Israel has to depend on people who are coming in. As the Crusades in the Middle Ages, they have to depend on people who are coming in. If nobody's coming in, that is the dissolution of those states, and it's exactly what was going on in the 60s. And in the attempt to create the kind of conditions to draw people in, the Israelis began to create plans to divert the waters of the Jordan River and the Yarmouk also, which is in the boundary between Syria and Jordan, and as such created the tension one more time between Egypt and Israel. Now, in addition to this as a factor, slowly the Palestinian national movement began to emerge in the idea, in the mind of certain individuals here and there. And indeed, by 1965, we have the formation of what came to be known as Fatah, Harakat al-Tahrir al-Palestine. And in 65, I remember the kind of tension that was being created, and the cross-border skirmishes, and that began to raise the level of tension between Egypt, Syria, and Israel. And more specifically in the north, when right after 1962 and the dissolution of the UAR, United Arab Republic, the competition, so to speak, between Nasser and the Syrian officers had created that kind of situation that allowed Israel to hit at one and hit at the other. This is the background that bring us to the 1967 war. Once again, the Arab nationalism is a force. The Arab unity is a force. Arab resources, oil is a resource, as a source, the region, the Suez Canal, all of that, the Cold War really pushes the realignment, so to speak, between these powers and the great, I would say, collusion at this particular point in time between the United States and Israel that led eventually to the 1967 war. For example, the tensions that had been building up were more cosmetic tensions. That is, again, because of the competition between the conflict between the Arab leaders themselves, whereas Israel, of course, took advantage of that. And in 1967, in early June 1967, the foreign minister of Egypt was on his way to Washington so that they can discuss ways of averting any conflict. But it was during his flight that the Israelis struck against Egypt. And indeed, this stealthy strike had destroyed the Air Force of Egypt and allowed the Israelis to have mastery of the air, and eventually, of course, that gave them the advantage on the ground. And very quickly, they moved into the Sinai Peninsula and took it over. They were able to take over the West Bank and eventually pushed into the Golan Heights and were able to take certain areas, and such as the city of Quneitra in late 67. And so you can see from the map on the screen that Israel had expanded its territory several fold, and in the process also created a new set of refugees, internally displaced, and some of them actually had to go across the river that is into to the east. So the situation was a disaster again for the Arab armies. It turns out they're not really prepared the way they should be. The kind of coordination has always been suspect, because it turns out after all these years that King Hussein was on the CIA payroll. King Hassan II of Morocco may have even told some of the plans. It just boggles the mind how unprepared the Arab governments were in their rhetoric to defend Palestine, which of course brings us to the point where the Palestinians said, enough is enough. We are going to head our own national liberation. And from that time onward, from 67 onward, it is really the constitution of an organization called the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, a truly Palestinian entity that begins to lead the struggle to liberate Palestine. And from that, of course, the rebirth, if you want, of Palestinian nationalism. Many territories have been taken by Israel in 67, and of course, that eventually would lead to the 1973 war, which is, you can call it the Ramadan War, the Yom Kippur War, the 1973 October War, happened to be in October. And it just happened to be this time I had come to UCLA as a student. It is a war that very quickly was declared to be for a limited purpose. And this is, I think, the great mistake, if you want, that Anwar al-Sadat, who had been the president at the time, Nasser died of a heart attack. I guess he just couldn't take it, all of the setbacks from this and another, and most specifically, the setback that had really destroyed his heart was in 1969, when the Palestinian, the PLO and the Palestinian forces had been expelled from Jordan. Between 67 to 69, the PLO had become so powerful that they were actually threatening the regime in Jordan. And also, they had become so powerful from the rest of the Arab world, especially after the 1968 Karama battle, when the Israelis tried to put an end to the PLO and its forces by invading a little known town across the Jordan River right here called Karama. I think the hubris of imperialism is infectious, and so Israel was thinking that it cannot be stopped any longer. After all, it defeated Egypt, Syria, Jordan in a matter of 5 or 6 days, and so they thought that they were going to take care of the PLO in a matter of hours. But as it turns out, it was a disaster for them and a great victory for the PLO. And of course, the PLO and the Palestinian forces it was a great recruitment event, and many Arabs joined the PLO at the time, and that again as a threat to the Jordanian regime, and then it led to a clash between the PLO and the Jordanian forces, and eventually the Palestinians were pushed out and eventually found themselves actually in southern Lebanon, Beirut, southern Lebanon, amongst the Palestinian refugees who were living in that region. So the disaster of 69, if you want, weighed heavily on Nasser, and eventually he died of a heart attack, which brought us to Anwar Sadat. Within a year or so, Anwar Sadat had planned and coordinated with Syria and Egypt to carry out what is known as came to be known as the October War. And he came out and said it's for a limited purpose only. The Egyptian forces were able to decisively defeat the Bar-Lev line, a line of defensive encampments and mechanisms, concrete bunkers, etc., along the Suez Canal built by Israel at the time to the tune of over $1 billion. And so that's for that time, it's a huge amount of money. So within hours, the Egyptian forces were able to storm the Bar-Lev line and eventually move on to 2 passes right in the middle of the Sinai called the Mitla Pass. And he says, okay, if this is for a limited time and limited purpose, allowed the Israeli army to cross the line, Suez Canal, around Suez City, and encircle the Egyptian army. That's when Henry Kissinger comes in. At the time, of course, he was the Secretary of State, and begins what is known as the shuttle diplomacy. The shuttle diplomacy very quickly came to be designed for the isolation of Egypt from the larger Arab-Israeli conflict. And indeed, shuttle diplomacy between 73, 74, all the way to 79, succeeded in removing Egypt from the theater of war, and brought us to what is known as the Camp David agreements. These agreements by which Israel would withdraw from the Sinai, the two will recognize each other, two forces will recognize each other, and indeed there are many other provisions to this agreement, an agreement that is being threatened as we speak by Israeli assault on Rafah. And I think maybe, you know, I know it's a very detailed history. I've been talking a lot about these heady developments. We may make another time to discuss the diplomatic endeavors from 1979, 1980, 81, when the Camp David agreements were signed, to the 90s, when the Oslo agreement was signed. And you can see how all of these agreements were actually designed in one way or another to isolate genuine resistance, to isolate genuine developments in favor of a status quo or a situation by which Israel would benefit rather than bring peace. So for another hour, I think this would be a great moment, and I think I should stop here so that we can carry the discussion from 1980 onward.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. This has absolutely been a lot of history in a short time. For some of us who've lived it, it's a reminder. But for those who don't know it, I hope that this will inspire them to dig a little bit deeper and learn more of the history. I think we have one question, if you don't mind, Erica.
Yes.
I don't mind, but I would want to add here that
Sure.
the bibliography that I sent, that's a good source for it's annotated in a way so that anyone who reads it will find, you know, what they it's a lot of books, but there's a lot more books than the Arab-Israeli conflict has been the subject of so much writing. And I just gave a general bibliography, but I can also provide, as I mentioned, specific bibliography for some of the topics if there need for that. And yes, I'd be happy to take the question.
Wonderful. Thank you. This has been very enlightening and very educational. So thank you so much, Dr. Mahmood Ibrahim. So the question is, can you please elaborate on what some say that when the UN partitioned Palestine and Israel's state was created, Arabs, Palestinians refused the partition, thus no Palestinian state was created?
Yes, I think it's, you know, one can, the metaphor that is used is that if I have a house and I welcome somebody in it, and in a matter of a month or so or a year, this particular guest says, look, I'm going to take half of your house. You know, what is your position at that particular moment? What do you say? Okay, you take the other half. And so this is the situation that had happened here, where within let's say the period from 1936 onward, the great number of Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany came and were welcomed into Palestine. By 1945, this is only this is 10 years. In 10 years, they are saying that they're going to take half of the country for themselves, to the exclusion of the Palestinian inhabitants, to the exclusion of the local indigenous population, not only in terms of living, but in terms of also taking over their land. And I mentioned once again that the partition had given the greater area of Palestine to the Jews, who were not, the numbers are here again, the Arab Muslim Christians were by 1947 1,324,000. The Jews, through migration, only 500,000 or 630,000. So for the 630,000, they were, and who are recent refugees, because you can see the numbers right there, from 1936 to 1947. You know, you give them half of the country, and you call it a Jewish state, where the population of that Jewish state is also 50% Arab. So it's the Palestinians like, you know, what is this incredulous proposition that you're giving us? You know, this is what the Palestinians found themselves in, being offered something that they have to refuse, indeed, because it's a great anomaly, it's a great injustice, and the Jews, of course, are going to say, we're going to welcome that. Of course, they're going to accept that. They were given half of the country, and they only, you know, a third of the population. And so, yes, indeed, the partition was declined, was not accepted because it was unjust. And the whole dilemma, as I mentioned, from the very moment of the Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration, the whole injustice starts from there. It's not just this partition was unjust. The whole issue is unjust. The mandate is unjust. And because the mandate was contradictory, it's supposed to give the Palestinians the opportunity to nurture themselves into a statehood, but instead they are being decimated year by year, not only in terms of population, but in terms of their economy, in terms of their culture. And so, yes, they will indeed refuse to abide by such an injustice. And anyone who can see this will see that it is really an unjust situation, an unjust partition.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. This is really critical for those who are following the news, following on social media, everything that is happening, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank. And for those who have really not in the past been informed or aware of the history of Palestine, and as you mentioned, the injustices that the Palestinians have gone through, it is critical to understand that history as a foundation to really take a stand and decide if they want to really support the Palestinians in their struggle for freedom and liberation and human rights. So I very much, on a personal level, very much appreciate all the information and the education that you've given us in those two lectures. And I'm looking forward to the next one, which will be specifically on Gaza. Reminder for everybody is going to be this Thursday, the 22nd at 7 p.m. Pacific time. And I look forward to seeing you on Thursday, inshallah.
Excellent.
Inshallah. And we'll find a way to share those the bibliography that you shared with us, because it's absolutely another great resource. And hopefully people are open to reading, not just getting their information off of social media.
Excellent. Very good.
Thank you, and God bless you, and have a blessed evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Erica.
And thank you, Sister Hadab, as well. Thank you, Dr. Mahmood Ibrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Salam alaikum.